thank you all for being part of this APSCC look back at 2021, which is already a big meal, and then looking forward to 2022, which will have to be speculative. But we know some of the things are going to happen. It's an industry. Somebody said a few months ago that if you left this industry 3 years ago and came back now, you basically have to start from scratch in terms of your knowledge of it, not in terms of overall dynamics, but just in terms of who's doing what kind of actors are important, what kind of money is changing hands, what governments are doing what. Just about everything has changed. And it makes it fascinating to follow on just about a daily basis. So just today, just to give you an example, this week we had two examples of things that have some effect on the Satcom business, not specifically APSCC, although certainly the announcement by Mangata Networks, founded by a guy who used to be one of the core team of O3B and OneWeb, that they had gotten Temasek of Singapore and KTSat as initial investors in their Series A round. Those are two strategic investors who are likely to be customers as well as partners of Mangata, and that makes Mangata much more credible now than it certainly was a year ago. And they've got a constellation of both highly elliptical satellites and medium orbit satellites for delivering big chunks of broadband to corporate and government customers. A little bit like the LeoSat model before LeoSat disappeared. So Mangata is a new thing. And then just today we had Intelsat. Never has a company in Chapter 11 done so much spending as Intelsat does. And the most recent thing is two software-defined satellites from Thales Alenia Space, which follows by about, I think, 8 months, another two satellite order that Intelsat made for software-defined satellites, this one from Airbus. And that's important, first of all, because it delivers on Intelsat's promise that they're going to be moving quickly, Chapter 11 or no, to build out a global network of flexible payload satellites. And they are just about out of bankruptcy, but they're still in it. And the second thing is that, as you all may remember, a couple of years ago, when these software-defined satellites were first being talked about, the idea was that, as is inherent in the name, they're defined by the software, mainly that the satellite hardware itself could be pretty much the same from one to another unit. And because of unit economics being what they are, that would mean that the satellite industry, which today has maybe 10 major manufacturers, more like 6 maybe or 7, wouldn't need as many, because the scale economies would migrate most of the orders to 1 or 2 or 3 manufacturers. Well, here we have now, with the Thales order, after a similar order for one satellite from SES, a second company after Airbus, consolidating its position in what is supposed to be a big telecom satellite manufacturing market niche, which is software defined, for lots and lots of reasons that maybe you all want to deal with in your remarks. But let's start. I'm just going to ask each of you to spend 2 or 3 minutes just off the top of your head, because there's too much stuff. Just what struck you about 2021 in the Satcom area, on the ground or in the air, whether it's regional or global, that sticks in your mind now and you think might have some relevance to 2022. So I'm looking at Robert because he's monopolizing my screen here. So Robert, why don't we start with you?
Well, I don't know how I'm doing that, Peter, but I
don't know either, but there it is. That's all right.
For me, the biggest trend that I saw this year that came, it's been in development for a long time, as most trends are, has to do with the telcoization of the satellite industry. It's still in the early days, but there has been a sea change, and I think the understanding among the people who make decisions in this business, both in space and on the ground, that our future is going to be different from our past. Our past has all been about operating in a very small niche or set of niches, delivering very specialized services that were mysterious and hard to understand, and only we, the wizards of satellite, could make it work. And increasingly, we're just basically rolling over and saying, oh, actually, all those brilliant standards that exist in terrestrial telecom are a really good idea. And 5G, of course, is, I think, driving that awareness. But what you're seeing is captured by something a CEO of a teleport operator said to me several years ago. He said, I've got 25 salespeople. I'm busy working on a deal with a major European carrier because they have 5,000 salespeople, and I want them selling my services. And the only way I can do that is if I'm a part of their BSS and their OSS, their operating support system and their business support system. So that's where I'm going. And I'm now seeing the entire industry following him.
No, that's an excellent point, and you're right. Aside from the boots on the ground stuff that you've just given an example of, just the atmospherics. Now, in all the public discourse, gone is the idea that satellite will be something much more than a strap-on to a telecommunications global network, which is mainly terrestrial, and they are the big dogs in the game, and we have to adapt to them. That's true. That dialogue has completely changed, and it's a damn good thing. We'll talk later about a couple of topics having to do with the international regulators meeting in next year, in 18 months or so, and what this change in dialogue might mean for things like 28 gigahertz and whether the terrestrial guys are able to play a little bit better with the satellite guys in terms of future access to spectrum. But I take your point. That's a major thing. Satcom, you're next on the left to right screen thing. What are your highlights for 2021?
Well, so much happening, it becomes difficult to make any summary. But if I quote, take 3 or 4, and maybe we'll discuss. So one is certainly still appetite for space financing, fundraising. We may come back to it. I mean, we measure at least 8 billion in equity for a number of companies. That could be even more than that, SPACs and others. So clearly the industry will have to deliver, but at the moment, a very large fundraising is one. A second one to me is still on constellation. It's kind of a year one for, at least trial phase for a SpaceX, first services / trials for OneWeb coming in. And plus, in even last quarter, a number of new filings for additional constellations moving forward. So this is kind of a pivotal moment for constellations. And ecosystem changing Viasat and Inmarsat merger, maybe a symbol of some discussions or the need for all the established players to adapt and look at their plans for the industry as it will be moving forward. And maybe a fourth point coming to what Robert mentioned is about telecom, but it's also about cloud. I mean, we've seen Microsoft, Amadeus and others making bigger steps in space just in 2021 and becoming more and more embedded into the ecosystem and multiplying partnerships with companies. There may be plenty of others, but these are already 4 of them.
There are plenty of others, but those are 4 good ones. I think most of them we'd all agree. Inmarsat, Viasat, we'll see whether that triggers anything. After all these years of waiting for horizontal consolidation, not seeing it on the operator level, not sure about that, but we will see if, as expected, that acquisition, gets approved by the UK and US authorities later in this year. So I take your point on all 4 of those. David Meltzer, you're next. What struck you as important in 2021, David?
Yeah, if I could cheat a little and go back to also 2020. We saw in 2020 as well as 2021 bankruptcy filings, not just Intelsat, which you mentioned, which is soon to emerge, but we saw a Speedcast, a New View, which was, I think, Global Eagle, OneWeb. And in each of those cases, the bankruptcy process has worked wonderfully from the company's perspective. They shed a lot of debt, they strengthened their balance sheet. And as we saw with Intelsat's transactions, which you just mentioned, as well as some in the past, it really has freed them to strengthen their business. So I see the bankruptcy filings and the successful restructurings that resulted as really creating much stronger industry players. OneWeb has attracted a lot of investment. I think we're all familiar with the British government investment, Bharti investment, but interestingly now from Eutelsat and Hughes, along with distribution agreements. And I'm sure we'll touch on LEO strategies for some of the GEO operators, but what we're seeing is the bankruptcy process working extremely well, very much strengthening the balance sheets of those companies and freeing them to engage in what I think will be, for some of them at least, transformative transactions that will very much impact the industry as a whole.
Good point. There is a special character to the U.S. Chapter 11 process. that isn't imitated in the rest of the world. And while it is good for companies and is heavily biased toward this a surviving entity coming out, it's not necessarily good for equity and junior debt holders. But I take your point from the company's point of view. Although again, Intelsat is a special. Happily for them, they now only got $7.5 billion of debt. So I guess everything is relative, but they are expected to come out in the next couple of months, if I've understood correctly. And you're right, for the others, it was a fairly speedy process, and now they're all now healthy and back in the game. So that's true.
And I would sorry, Peter, I would just point out, and you may touch upon this, but in the US with the C-band auction and the FCC proceeds in the billions of dollars to Intelsat and SES, and to a lesser extent, Eutelsat and Telesat, that will also have obviously a very strong impact on their balance sheets and further strengthen those companies.
Fair point. Greg Daffner, let me go to you. Greg, how did 2021 look from where you sit?
Well, I think everyone already said everything to be said. No, if we're going to talk about money and raising money, one of the big issues I think was SPACs for space. Okay, so these are the blank check companies that are legally permitted under U.S. law to issue forward-looking projections, even wildly unrealistic projections, which normally would be prohibited under law if they were doing traditional IPOs. And the actual SPAC experience has existed for many years, but it really kicked off in our industry in late 2020 with Momentous and AST. In 2021, we had Rocket Lab with Planet, Black Sky, Astrospace, Spire, and others. And the sad thing is that the performance, if we take a look at where the stocks are today, SPACs all list at $10 a share. So it's easy to see exactly where they are relative to where they started. Of those stocks, the performance has been dismal. They've all plummeted like 50, 60%. The only exception being Rocket Lab. I don't know, maybe there's someone else that I've missed. It's sort of reminiscent of the hype that fueled the internet bubble back in the early 2000s, and we know how that ended. I think it's unfortunate because I suspect that most, if not all of these companies have real substantive stuff to give us, but they got caught up in this whirlwind opportunity to raise large sums of money, and I think it may end up eating them up. So I think that's unfortunate. You mentioned in the beginning, Peter, the announcement about the new satellites that Intelsat is buying, even though they're in the throes of bankruptcy. I think one of the magnificent things is that the courts allowed them to borrow money, even in the process of trying to figure out how they can become more reasonable in their approach and use of their money. The other thing that they did, if I remember correctly, was they in terms of 2021. There was an amazing, a day in October where both the CEO of Intelsat and Eutelsat quit. It was a weird kind of coincidence. One of the things that came out of that, though, in not of the resignations, but of the bankruptcy of Intelsat, was a recognition that their bankruptcy was not because they piled up debt by their operational missteps, but it was imposed by the private equity investors that just took a huge amount of money out of their company, out of Intelsat, to line their own pockets. I don't know what we can do about that happening again for other companies. And as you point out, that the bankruptcy process has shaved about 50% of that debt off their books, still leaving them with a considerable amount, but at least a fighting chance to rebuild. But the more interesting thing is that the bankruptcy court allowed them to borrow money, a considerable amount of money, to buy GoGo, which overnight put them into the driver's seat of leading a significant aeronautical services company, which, even though it hasn't been doing great for the last year or so because of the COVID, I think we all agree it's one of the long-term growth opportunities for the industry. And it begins, or is one of the most recent success stories of vertical integration in our business. So I think that's an exciting dimension that we should look for happening across the board.
All right, two things. Let me just push back in. I'll invite David or Robert or Pacom to jump in too. So on the SPACs, so I agree directly with what you're saying, but of course SPACs are for two things. First, to give the original shareholders an asset that they could trade and add more to, or trade in terms of merger and acquisitions for the company management, or get out of, and to put money on the balance sheet of the company, and then of course to attract more money from the public markets. And you touched on that last point, which hasn't worked out so well in the last 6 months. But 6 months for a lot of these companies isn't much time, because as you correctly point out, a lot of them are in such early stages. They didn't have a chance to prove anything before they went public, which might be a defect that you were referencing. So it's a little early to be counting them out in terms of their business. And as far as the public markets, the companies have this cash on the books anyway. They didn't have to give it up. And if the stock goes south for 6 months or a year, they're not necessarily going to pay a heavy price for that. I guess we'll have to see how much they depend on public equity markets for the next capital raise. But a couple of them have pretty sizable cash balances as a result of these SPACs that they wouldn't have otherwise, and they've still got that. So let me ask Pacom, David, or Robert. Is it? I mean, Greg mentioned it. The private equity investments, the leveraged buyouts of the 1990s that resulted in heavy debt, particularly on Intelsat, but on a couple of others as well. That's perfectly legal. That hasn't gone away. In fact, in a SPAC environment, the private equity companies now pass for conservative investors. But should we look at is SPACs a good thing, bad thing, or we shouldn't say either or? Robert, let's start with you.
Wow. So we're talking about finance, business, and I guess justice or morality in one question. We know what happens when people have access to a lot of essentially free money. They usually don't spend it very well. And we know what happens when private equity sees a cash-rich company that it feels doesn't need all that cash. So I happen to believe that huge bales of cash falling from the sky, generally speaking, are a bad thing for business. I think you need to prove the business model. In fact, I remember talking to a venture capital investor who basically said, you got to prove to me it works before I'm going to spend any money with you. And by taking away that pressure to prove that it works, I think you have some interesting challenges you create. Long term, who knows? Maybe it'll turn out to be a brilliant innovation. I just think the track record for loads and loads and loads and loads of money on a new idea, generally speaking, is not very good.
Fair enough. A couple of these companies argued that what they're using the cash for is to advance the schedule of a business plan they'd already laid out to shareholders that would have taken them years to work into because of the CapEx involved, and now they can do it fairly quickly. That may be the case. I mean, that may turn out. It's just really kind of a question of, if you will, the percentages, the numbers, right? How many of them are going to go down that route? That takes a lot of discipline. That's true. David, what do you think?
So your question is, are SPACs good? If I'm an investor in a SPAC, chances are it turns out to be not a good investment. And I say chances are because as Robert mentioned, the money isn't quite free, but it is available. It's funding a lot of, on paper, very good projects. But I think we know from other industries, a large number of these SPACs will not succeed in terms of turning profitability and making a return on the investment for the investor. Taking a different perspective on SPACs are good. I think from a broadly speaking, all the other stakeholders, I do think it's good. You're talking about an industry where the barriers to entry have been lowered dramatically. Certainly we saw on the launch side, but we're seeing elsewhere where very small satellites can be launched for a fraction of what we were talking about 5 or 10 years ago. And I think with the emergence of SPACs, a lot of very interesting technology is getting funding it would not otherwise get. And I think we will see very significant consolidation among these new entrants. But at the end of the day, I think we'll see some very good technology and new services and new connectivity resulting from the gold rush of investment in space and satellite communications in particular. So from the non-investor perspective, I do think SPACs are very good, because I think in 5 or 10 years, you are going to see some of that money having funded really good technology, which results in transformative goods and services.
Yeah. And a quick question for all four of you. You all might know the answer. What was the first satellite telecommunications SPAC?
Well, I have no idea.
Well, there one prior to Iridium. I mean, Iridium goes for sure.
I believe it was Iridium. Yeah. I mean, Iridium was one. I'm just not sure they were the first, but certainly 20 odd years ago, they were the first, and they certainly come out of that entire process and the bankruptcy as well, looking very good. But Satcom, while you've got the mic, give us your general sense of the SPAC.
So I think that's one of the points. So first, maybe very quickly to your point on private equity and leverage. I think on the traditional funds, there's been some good stories in the last decade, such as Marlins, that had, PE firms like APACS and others have had a pretty good track record and story, and some companies that were far too much leverage. And I think the Intelsat story could be worth a book almost, as it's a combination of several LBOs. Anyway, on the SPACs, so the reality of the industry of the last 3-4 years is, because so many companies are early stage in concepts, industry has been financed primarily through equity and venture capital. I mean, from a concept, from a Starlink to a OneWeb, even prior to SPACs, if you look at how much has been funded through debt and equity, most of it is equity, just because it's too risky for debt for many cases, in many cases. And to a certain extent, the recent SPACs compared, Iridium was maybe partly that with the next constellation, but recent SPACs take the position of venture capital, essentially, for many of the companies, not all cases, but most of them are pre-revenues or almost pre-revenues. So risk profile is obviously high. I would definitely not suggest that targeted revenues are very, very high for a number of companies. Many of them target, 500 million in 3-5 years, which is obviously will be difficult to achieve in any case. So whether it's good or bad, there could be definitely, I think as venture capital, there could be success stories and there could be failures. I think what will be critical for the industry is that there are at least some success stories. And it's venture capital. If you have a balance, let's say, between successes and failures, that would work. If there's too much of an imbalance, that's the issue. It still puts companies in a position to reach a commercial service. So they would have enough funding to have satellites in orbit to launch services and test the market, which is a big difference for certain of them. And I'm pretty sure it will trigger some M&A as well. You have two ways to increase your revenues. One is to just invest organically in your assets. The other is to buy existing business or complement yours and grow that way. So I would be very surprised that all that funding does not result. There's been a few already, but does not result in more M&A and acquisitions in the next couple of years.
To strap on, and we've seen Planet and Rocket Lab, Astra make some strap-on acquisitions, and I guess one important metric will be in the coming years, if we're going to have a big tightening in the U.S. equity markets, and the U.S. Federal Reserve has suggested that's coming quickly, then that will make it more difficult for the investors in these SPAC companies to exhibit the kind of patience that they're going to need. If they're going to hold these companies to their quarterly revenue projections that they all put out there as they were SPACing or de-SPACing, then that's going to be rough. But if they can be patient, it might be a slightly better story. I guess we'll have to see about that.
It's fair to say that some SPAC process has taken more time than initially envisaged, and some of the fundraising in some of the recent story may have been a bit lower than in the initial plan. So as well, SPACs bring a lot of money, but we can't say there's absolutely no Well, or maybe there will be in 2022 deeper look and the review of how much can be raised and value of the business, etc. So, if anything, this shall mature a little, let's say, as a source of funding.
All right, Packham, I should ask this before I get an SMS. What is your cat's name?
Yeah.
It's Marvin. Where it is? Yeah, it does not like closed doors. Definitely. So.
Well, okay, you just solved that problem. All right, Packham, I should mention here, just because I'm going to tease you a little bit, just because I can. So one of the changes in 2021 is that we saw a consulting company jump actually into the game. I've got a couple of jokes about consultants that I probably can't tell in this forum, but anyway, so now you've violated those jokes by actually coming into the game by being one of the leaders of a consortium that's put a bid to the European Commission to manage a constellation whose definition is not yet clear, based on secure comms for governments, broadband, quantum key distribution, that sort of thing. So that was, could you say just something briefly about that? This is a first for Euroconsult, I should think, correct me if I'm wrong, and just what was, I mean, it's a kind of a daring thing. I remember reading it and thinking, that took some chutzpah to do that, or maybe it didn't.
Well, not really. So, I mean, it's also giving a fair description. So, just to give a bit of background, there is that European initiatives around secured communication where the EU may want to acquire assets, let's say, to deliver secured connectivity, and there are different flavors into that, but up to broadband connectivity for government purpose, essentially. As part of that, the EU has requested architecture studies and consortium to be developed to propose architectures to the EU for it to make decisions and what architectures could make sense and how to work with the private sector. So, as you suggest, we are one of the leaders in one of the consortium. As it stands, I would certainly not suggest that Euroconsult intends to become a satellite operator of such an architecture. As it is in our support role, and I've been having work in government programs for a number of years, including for the EU. So we are a partner in that studies phase of the architecture. I think the purpose of those studies is also to propose architectures that make sense, but that to a certain extent are also open. So what will be the next phase in terms of the partnership and organization taking a role in the operation and service delivery and manufacturing or launch of the assets that would be built is, I would say, a successor to the studies taking place. But it's fair that the EU is to make decision or give directions this year out of all those activities running. So, but we're not an operator at the moment or a service company or manufacturer.
No, but your name was in the headlines of the leaders of the consortium making this.
We are in this project.
Yeah. It was interesting. All right, let me slice and dice some of this stuff yet. So let's talk to Asia specifically for a minute. We've had now, thanks in part to APSCC and to some other venues, most of the larger satellite fleet operators in East Asia testify as to how they think the market is evolving and their place in it. For our US audiences, it should be reminded that the decline in linear television and cable head-end delivered TV that you see in the United States, which has caused some problems for SES and EchoStar and, of course, Intelsat, is nowhere near as pronounced in the rest of the world. Satellite direct broadcast television looks like it has a long tail, and while it's not growing, it's still delivering a lot of cash to most of the other companies, satellite fleet operators involved in the business. So you have to sort of move forward a bunch of years before maybe you'll see in the rest of the world the kinds of decline that you see in the United States now. So having said that, these operators see the same trends as everybody else. They've got to lead the runner in the sense of making the changes to adapt to what they think might be their world in 2020 and 2030, even if it's not as urgent as it is in the United States right now. So let me go back to let me start with Greg on this one. Greg, have you seen any of the regional operators here say anything that stuck in your mind as a strategy going forward? I'm assuming now, and you guys mentioned it, that several global broadband constellations And of course, we've got some narrowband stuff going on, not just with Inmarsat and Viasat, but with several constellations coming up in narrowband, are moving forward. They fail in 10 years, they don't, they get the markets they want, we don't know, but they're going forward, they're going to be here. Have you heard anything from a regional operator that strikes you as a protective coating to make sure they're not overwhelmed by this? Okay,
so first of all, most of, in fact, with I think only one exception today, most of the operators have a lack of HTS capacity in their fleets. Okay, so when it comes to price competition with LEO systems, they're going to be in a very awkward position. However, the good news is that I think that these Asian operators are taking a look at the question of which, if any, of the LEOs to partner with. Because the fact of the matter is, when you're doing a global system, as the LEO constellations are doing, they lack the most important part of a successful business strategy, which is feet on the ground, knowledge of the market, contacts, connection, and regulatory access. Okay, so the bottom line is the LEOs need partners, which puts the Asian satellite operators in the driver's seat. So they're going to decide, I think, two things. One, who, if any, of the LEOs are they going to partner with as a distributor in their own country or some other countries that they have special access to? Versus, are they going to focus on partnering with the large GEO HTS operators as a distributor? Because the large GEO operators, Viasat's a perfect example. When they do Viasat 3 in Asia, Viasat's not going to be positioned to be able to walk into markets with any kind of ease without partners, local partners. The second question is going to be trying to figure out a way of lobbying their own local governments on how to keep their markets protected while not appearing publicly to be lobbying against Elon. I mean, I think that's, and it's very specifically Elon, because I think that'll make them very unpopular among their populace. So my experience is that most of the operators have kicked the tires on every LEO project over the last 4 or 5 years, but they're still taking a wait and see approach. It's a little bit early because other than Starlink, nothing is even close to operational. I mean, OneWeb will become operational in the not too distant future. So they realize they've got captive regulators and they've got people on the ground to sell and deploy. And so I think they are in the negotiating catbird seat. Now, on the other side of it, if you take a look at how difficult it is, the best example is Starlink trying to get into India, announcing that they were doing it, starting to sell their terminals and subscriptions, and then getting unceremoniously kicked out. And if you think back, and to me, this is one of the most—
Hang on, not kicked out, not kicked out. They were advised that regulations are for everyone, not just everyone except Starlink.
Well, yeah. But again, I think the reality is that market access has always been a low, slow, tedious process for foreign operators entering every country, almost every country in the world, but certainly all across Asia. And no matter what value, and this is kind of an unfortunate dimension, no matter what value the operators bring to the indigenous industry and populations of the country in terms of making life better, that's not enough. There still are all kinds of special interests that are going to block what is in the best interest of those countries. I mean, in my judgment, okay? But I'm a free marketeer. One of the interesting things, and I don't know that this was something that the Indian government was specifically responding to, but if you think back, I actually saw it, and only because I got lucky. Elon wrote a tweet on September 2nd in which he, and I'll quote, because I copied this thing because I knew I would lose it. Our satellites launching in the next few months have intersatellite laser links, so no local downlink needed. Another Twitter head replied, how does transmitting into a country without a local downlink work on the regulatory side? And Elon, being Elon, did something that was pure Elon. And he said, quote, they can shake their fists at the sky.
Right.
Now, I'm a big fan. but I don't see it as serving his interests or his company's interests in getting into any market. Now, I'm sure that everyone in the company has walked that back, but we can, we take a look at how these things work. And I think that it's going to, when the local incumbent goes to the regulator and says, we want to work with this operator, I think that's when, in most of these countries, this operator, whoever it is going to be able to get access into that market. I think that otherwise it's going to be, unfortunately, a really long time. And remember, they don't have, as in the case of GEO operators, 15 years to wait for their satellites till they come to the end of their life. They've got to get things going fast, or they're going to be out of business long before that day comes.
Yeah, that's fair. And we all noticed that the consumer only going direct to the consumer, like they do in Western Europe and the United States and Canada and elsewhere, it doesn't work everywhere. And Starlink has now put some water in its wine and saying that they want to work with the mobile network operators and have an indirect, more of a wholesale model. So I think they see reality too. And you're right, they've got a logistical problem before them if they're going to build out their entire constellation that is formidable. Robert, what do you think of, what have you heard anything from Asia that strikes you as interesting in terms of adapting to the new market, at least on data?
Well, I think Greg said it right. What we're hearing is a lot of silence. There's a lot of tire kicking. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of discussion underneath. But from a public standpoint, a lot of silence. The thing that's really struck me, and Greg, I really appreciate you calling it out. Eastern and Western Asia has a bigger tradition of national champion projects, I think, national champion satellite systems than I think any other region, right? And so that's where you get this. The walls are up because the government's basically made this thing happen and the government can't afford to let it go. And it plays two ways. I mean, the other way it plays is, I remember talking to a service provider in India about, this issue of, well, your big global carriers, big global satellite operators really can't get into your country. How does that affect your business? He says, I love it. I said, really? Why? He said, because what I can buy from, our national champion carrier, I get at incredibly cheap rates. So it's great business. And I thought, okay, this stuff works for some people, but as Greg says, what you don't know is the opportunity cost that comes with it in terms of what the people and the businesses in that country can't get. No, I wish I did have some news, but I just think that the structure of the market is very important to keep in mind.
Fair enough. David.
Yeah, so I think Greg hit on the key points. I would, I guess, push back on what I heard. One conclusion from Greg that the regional operators are perhaps in the catbird seat when it comes to negotiating distribution agreements or investment agreements with the global LEOs or other global operators. I think it's a pretty level playing field in terms of negotiating strength. Simply because, and Greg mentioned this, the regional operators realize that there is a tail to their DTH business, and they are very much looking to protect themselves from the deterioration of that business. There was an interesting interview that I read just yesterday. The new CEO of Satcom talked about the need to diversify their business. They, of course, they saw their concession go back to the Thai government for some of their satellites. And so I think there's a realization, as Greg mentioned, among the regional operators that, yeah, they cannot sit idly by because with the LEOs, the high throughput satellites, the industry is changing. And while they may be somewhat insulated because of the national policies that tilt towards the regional operators, I think they realize, yeah, they do have to make an investment or at least form a commercial relationship with some of these operators. And I think ultimately that will be good, not just for the companies involved, but as well ultimately for the stakeholders, whether they be consumer, enterprise, or even government, because we will see new businesses, new services, new goods coming to the market.
No, that's fair. I usually, whenever I hear the word Satcom, I usually ask for a moment of silence in compassion for that company for that company and its travails with its own government over the last 15 years. But we don't have time here, so we're moving on. Pacom, anything on the Asian side, whether it's south or central or east, that you've heard that suggests a way forward to the extent these guys are going to need one in the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's true for a number of regional operators, not just in Asia, but when you look at Asia, certainly some of the companies are trying to pivot or see. Obviously, good part of the growth story would have to be data centric, even if there's durable revenues from broadcast and everything. So if you look at a few examples in Japan in the last, I think, 2 to 3 years, a good part of the extra revenues came either from a PPP with the government for Sky Perfect or from trying to venture into other, even new space businesses outside of what they used to do. In Malaysia, EMEA Sat, ahead of their new satellite, have started to get more into the service layer, either for broadband or village connectivity. So the need for operators also to consider what is their end-to-end value proposition is there. And in a data-centric environment, one of the assets they can have is obviously their access to the local market. And the typical traditional anchor client for your future can be the universal access programs, could be defense and security at large, or maybe some agreements with telcos or other local services. But for obviously, they can have their play in two of those and place a local strengths, let's say, on top of having high quality assets and services. So is there rationale for partnership with LEOs? For sure there is, I think both sides of the time. For regional operators is really making sure that they build new skills and that they maintain their value into the game, which is really local access and grow. And it could come back also to the need to have flexible assets, because several of those companies may have 3-4 satellites, and it's difficult to know where the future lies. So even if some first acquisition of software-defined assets have been more by global or large operators, such orders have been maybe 2/3 of the GEOs procured last year. So I think for regional operators moving forward, having flexible assets for themselves, 1 or 2 anchor GEO assets or more, and then GSO would have to be a good or likely direction, I think, for the middle term.
All right, let me very, very quickly, starting with Robert, then Greg, then David, then Pacom, very quickly on this one, because we're time is moving more quickly than I'd wish. On the regulatory access side, no one wants to forecast the future commercial viability of a Starlink or a OneWeb or an Amazon Kuiper or the Telesat Lightspeed or whatever the European Commission might want to do. But you know that there are also active plans in China. Work is going on. We'll see what they want to do with it, but there's development going on in China. Russia has for a long time now talked about the same thing. Whether they can make it work, we don't know. And there are 1 or 2 others. Is it feasible to have a global LEO broadband system without some major government support and not get access to China and India, which is what, 40% of the global population, something like that?
Is it feasible?
Well, you're looking at, among the geographies that don't have regular terrestrial broadband access, China and India is a large piece.
Well, as Elon said, they can just shake their fists at the sky. I don't know. It's going to be a mess. There's nothing about the LEO constellations. Excuse me?
You were on mute, I think it's coming back.
I'm good. I'm glad.
No, you weren't too good, Robert.
I do talk to myself sometimes, but let's not do it. It's going to be a mess from a regulatory standpoint. There's not going to be enough spectrum. There's going to be huge issues in every way. So to me, yes, that's an enormous issue. I just think that it's got to get in line with everybody else in terms of sorting out the regulatory aspects of multiple NGSO systems operating in the same space as MEO and LEO. Sorry, MEO and GEO.
Greg, you said something a couple minutes ago that surprised me a little bit. So the governments of Asia, they're all not all identical, obviously, but a good number of them are as much in thrall of Elon Musk as.
No, I was talking about the youth of Asia. I think that he is an icon here, as well as he is in the West, where you're familiar. But in terms of answering your question, first of all, I think with regard to China, it's a two-way street. There's the question of China getting access to other markets and LEOs and others getting access to China's market. I think the bottom line is that that nobody's going to get access to the Chinese market except for Chinese owned and operated infrastructure. So I think that even though there's a lot of people and maybe a lot of opportunity, it's going to be foreclosed unless there's some extraordinary compromise deal that's made, and that would involve making it a local company of sorts. Okay. Yeah. I think that realistically, China is going to be fine not getting into a large part of the West. I think what we've seen very specifically with regard to Huawei, and most recently, it was the FCC kicked China Telecom, as local U.S. affiliate, out of the United States, delicensed it in October of last year. The reality is that they're not going to be, the Chinese government and their operators are not going to be surprised by this kind of behavior in the US as well as in Western Europe and some other places. I think that the bottom line is that there are a lot of markets, maybe 180 countries that are not going to have their own national operators. So there's no reciprocity issue. It's just a question of who's going to give me inexpensive, reasonable services. And except those countries that are particularly concerned about very specific political security issues, a la the Huawei issue, I think that they're going to be happy to allow access to Chinese operators, LEO service operators in their countries. And I think that's just a reality. It's going to come. I think we're also going to find that the Chinese are in a position where they're going to subsidize a lot of those operations as a way of creating goodwill. Or facilitating subsidies that seem to be doled out by the national governments. I think that in India it's a different story. India, for one thing, has got a connection. Bharti's got a connection with OneWeb. Not a connection, an ownership position. So I think that Bharti's going to be in a position where they're going to have a what do they call it? Where you have too much. They're going to have, on the one hand, the relationship with EchoStar Hughes. So they're going to be doing Project Jupiter kind of stuff in India. They'll be distributing, and they have had a relationship for, 10, 20 years. And I think the OneWeb connection is going to have them be the distributor for a LEO system there. So as to whether or not anyone else will be able to get in, it's unclear. And it's unclear whether it'll happen, if it happens in as timely a fashion as it needs to happen. Because I think what will happen is, as we've always seen, is that things are really slow. Decisions take forever. Yeah. And that the Indian government, even in the natural course of things, without politics and without protectionist perspectives, are going to be slow to just open the gates. And so therefore they may well say, well, we've got OneWeb. We don't need another one until we see how that goes and whether there's need for more capacity. And I think Robert's also right. I think that one of the things that we have witnessed is that there's a lot of jockeying at the ITU in coordination with great difficulty between and among the Western LEOs, that when they come up against the Chinese, that they're going to discover that all the deals they've made on this side are going to have to be remade to either facilitate the Chinese operation, or you have that territory, we have this territory, so we don't have the interference issue.
Right. Although a global LEO operator that has to subtract from his addressable market a China or an India or vast swaths of territory, that looks like a more challenging business model.
Well, I would just add one more thing. I mean, you mentioned Tycom. Tycom was the first HTS operator in the world with IPstar. And when IPstar was launched, they had beams over, and they still have beams over on a dozen countries across Asia. And bizarrely enough, they did not work out the regulatory market access issues before they launched, and they didn't work out those issues for many, many years after they launched. So you can say, yes, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a real problem. And it's going to be catastrophic potentially. I agree with you. But we've seen it happen before.
Okay. Yeah, sure. And Inmarsat and Thuraya and Iridium would all tell you that it's still a live issue, getting access capital by capital, nation by nation. David, on the regulatory side, before we move on to some of the more technical stuff,
yeah, I mean, I think, to boil down the question, is the world big enough to support multiple LEO systems? 2 or 3, yes. Can a LEO system be profitable if it's denied access to the Chinese market or the Indian market? I think it can be. I'm obviously not privy to all of the financials, but I'm also, very much guided. Yeah, it's ancient history, but if you look way back around the 1960s and 70s, you had Intelsat and Intersputnik. I mean, East versus West, very much. The world was big enough to overcome the political divide, and both Intelsat in particular, but Intersputnik in its own way, managed to survive for decades. So I do think, the market ultimately will cause a few to succeed, notwithstanding the difficulties some of the entrants, particularly in China, for the reasons Greg and others have pointed out, in gaining access. So I'm optimistic. Certainly not the many LEO entrants that almost on a daily basis are announced will succeed, but we'll see a few.
Fair enough. All right, Satcom.
Well, I think Greg said most of what I could think of. It's a fair statement as well. First generation of constellation is a matter of return based on equity being raised versus debt and the rest. Can you cover your operating costs? Can you keep running? So what is the definition of what's minimum success and what's sustainable is a fair question. Admittedly, a good part of the upcoming business is still backed or supported by governments. Would it be Canadian? Would it be UK? Would it be others? So when we look at access, I tend to agree with Greg. Indian approach, theoretically, policy has been, if there's something we can't have from Indian asset, we may open the door if there is a need to serve our ICT market, but it can definitely take the time it needs. So, which, right or wrong. China, in my view, honestly, NGSO in China is just a very, very small piece in the global ICT and technology battle at play and fight for leadership worldwide. So I don't see why suddenly a GSO constellation in space would be an exception to what's taking place in the telecom market. And for reciprocity or a Chinese constellation, but it could apply immediately to a European constellation program backed by the EU. It depends how much of a commercial versus government-owned operation it is. So what it is really as an operator constellation. But the rest of the world can be big enough. Obviously, having access to the largest populated countries can't be a bad thing if you can make it happen.
And on the European side, as you know better than I do, a lot of that stuff is still TBD. What the split between commercial and government use. All right, gentlemen, let me switch gears here for a second. We've now got 28 gigahertz is still with us as a problem for some satellite broadband operators who thought they got from the ITU spectrum for use in satellite broadband, and then many companies started opting out, which is their legal right to do so. And recently, I've been hearing that 3GPP, the 5G Standards Organization, is now saying things along the lines of the 28 gigahertz ought to still be an open field between terrestrial and satellite. Who wants to take this one as to what you've heard about the status of this? Are we going to see at WR323 next year, the World Radio Communication Conference of Regulators, 28 gigahertz coming up yet again? David, let me start with you.
Are you going to hear it? Sure, because the mobile industry is rapacious in terms of wanting more and more spectrum, even though their usage of the spectrum that they already have is far below what they anticipated. They're famous for projecting great demand, insatiable demand, and certainly demand goes up, but not to the degree that they project. So, yeah, they'll fight for 28, but I think what is really significant is that there are many successful satellite businesses providing critical services to not just the consumers in those countries, but the businesses and, importantly, the government. So I don't think the regulators will ultimately be persuaded when the mobile industry comes in, and again, without really a good business case, other than pie in the sky projections, start saying we want even more spectrum. So I think the fact that there are billion-dollar investments already by the industry, that there are many millions and millions of customers for those satellite services in 28, and I think very much the regulators are realizing that the mobile industry very much overstates the case when it comes to demand for additional spectrum. We're seeing in the United States in 5G, the take up, in millimeter wave in 26 isn't quite what the mobile operators anticipated. It's not the sweet spot like the C-band is often portrayed. So will there be a battle? Yeah, but I do think the facts are very strong in this case for the regulators to say to the mobile industry, no, you guys have more than enough. Keep your hands off at 28.
Okay, and let's say that's true. It doesn't prevent individual countries from deciding to go another way and just opting out. And this is what we've seen in 28. So you might have the facts on the ground superseding what the ITU does at its triennial WRCs. Greg, go ahead.
No, I think David summed it up, but I'd point out that the big picture is two things. I mean, yes, rapacious is an understatement. The reality is that going into the WRC 19, there was 1.9 gigahertz of bandwidth that had already been set aside for 5G. And the truth of the matter is that they got 17.25 gigahertz of additional spectrum, of which about 15 gigahertz of that has been harmonized globally. Okay, it doesn't include 28 gig. So the question is, how much land does a man need? How much spectrum does an industry like the mobile industry need? The answer is that what they need has nothing to do with what they want and what they are asking for. They will ask for more, but I will put it to you that no matter how this works out, David and others, that this is 5G. They're already starting in on 6G, and they're going to say, sorry, the other spectrum was allocated to 3G and to 4G, and we're still operating that, and 5G. We need new spectrum for 6G. So even when we win this, and I think we will, I think you're right. I think that the facts are just so overwhelmingly in our favor. But even when we do, they're going to come back with 6G. And by the time we put that fire out, if we succeed, it'll be 7G. So, I mean, it is seriously, it's Sisyphus. It's the most remarkable story. But I got some good news for you. I mean, I just today saw an announcement from the Satellite Industry Association of India, another association that we work with here in Asia, a fairly new association that was founded last year. I didn't mention it as one of the developments of 2021. And they just published there's a proceeding that just took comments this past week. I think that a number of our associations have participated in, and they just came out with a study showing that India stands to lose $200 billion if they do reallocation of satellite spectrum to 5G services in that country. And they focus specifically on C-band, and they focus and the effect that it will have on what you described earlier, Peter, is the long tail of broadcasting, which is distributed via satellite in India, as well as much of the rest of the world, and 28 gigahertz. So we're becoming more effective in our pushback, and we're demonstrating the material effect that this has from a financial perspective, from a life perspective, and hopefully these arguments will resonate with regulators, not just in the ITU, but also country by country, because at the end of the day, that is where the rubber meets the road.
Fair enough. All right, let me start with Robert here on a different question, because we only got a few minutes left. I'm going to presume we've got another 5 or 6 since we started a bit late. Robert, you noticed that the EMEA, the European Satellite Operators Association, that morphed into the EMEA Satellite Operators Association, is now gone global, and there are some companies they have and some companies they don't have as they go global. I've heard a couple of satellite fleet operators say in the last few years there are really too many associations and we're weaker for it. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I'm going to ask you if you think it is. In which case, is the creation of a Global Satellite Operators Association a good thing, and might that be able to make a better case, a more coordinated, unified case for the industry in forums like 3GPP or its successor or the WRC meetings?
Well, I've been hearing that from a lot longer than just 2 years. It's a perennial thing whenever business is not quite as good as it used to be. The answer is that each one of these associations exists for a particular mission, right? So we all, my colleague down there, David at GVF, they've got a very particular mission. It's a good focused mission. Mm-hmm. The things we run, again, focused missions. If you were all in one great big association, would you pull more weight? Associations, we like to think of ourselves as very important, but in terms of trying to pull a lot of weight and really seriously influence major financial and regulatory decisions, I think we help, but we don't help as much as, a licensee, for instance, in regulatory saying, I have to have this for the following reason. So I think I've always thought that was just one of those things you say because, obviously there's too many of this and I hate writing the checks for them, but I think we each serve our mission, and if we serve it well, people will support it.
Yeah. I didn't hear anybody from the Global Satellite Operators Association say that they wanted to eat the World Teleport Association or the Global VSAT Forum or anything like that. What they did say was that this might help sharpen the spear as satellite operators go into some of these international fora for spectrum.
What I hear from the regulatory people that I work with is basically, look, at the end of the day, this is a ground game. Yes, we're going to go to the WRC, we're going to do all those things, but what really matters is if there's a critical mass of businesses within a country that are willing and able to talk to their regulator and say, if you make this decision, here's what happens to my business, going back to Greg's point, or going back to David's point. So that's really, it's kind of like local elections. This is really where the battle is fought. And the rest of this is extremely important from a policy standpoint, but it's not where you actually win.
Okay, fair enough. All right, they're telling me my internet connection is unstable again. I've got one more question for you guys. It's a quick answer, please. And it comes out of, you might say it comes out of left field, but so be it. Last year or so, some of those of us who study the industry but are not technically proficient in terms of how close satellites can fly to each other, how easy it is to identify one from the other when you add in the unknowns of the existing debris environment. So my question has to do with around 600 kilometers in orbit and what's happening with SpaceX. Amazon Kuiper is coming. Half a dozen other constellations are going there soon. I haven't heard anybody be able to quantify this threat in terms of a likely collision or a likely between debris and a satellite or two satellites. Once you get several thousand more satellites in this fairly small band of orbital real estate, you heard Elon Musk, who is forever at his Twitter feed, say that billions of satellites could be put into LEO without a problem, which I guess is theoretically true, but I'm speaking of the specific bands that constellation operators want to have. So I basically want to get each of you to say whether this is an immediate problem that has to be addressed very, very soon, because if we stopped everything now, there'd still be more satellites launched that are already authorized to launch, or whether this is overblown. So let me start with Pacom.
Sorry. Yes. Well, that's a good point. So, people in our teams have been working on this. SSA or traffic management topic in the last year, which become a bigger one. There has been studies on how many collisions which could happen. Could we see suddenly hundreds and thousands of collisions in a year? Likely not, which is a reason why also we may be in that gray area. To me, what is striking and could be, in my view, a changing point or a game changer, is that question of human spaceflight. I mean, we've just seen the last reaction of China against SpaceX, but the fact is that outside of 600, more and more constellations are coming closer to Earth, or willing to, and are more and more in the vicinity of human spaceflight operations. And collisions could happen, but if you have a risk of critical collisions or risk to such type of operations, that could be ISS or other forms of upcoming tourism, human spaceflight, whatever, that could result in countries or certain administration really stepping in and becoming much more requiring, let's say, in terms of what's needed, what's asked to operators. So that's more my thoughts as opposed to regulation as it is, or for any licensing today. But I think from one year to another, it could certainly change in case of any dramatic event in a quite big way.
When you're talking about a human habited space station, China's or the international one?
Yeah, it could be ISS, could be the China space station, or maybe some future space exploration programs and assets if there is some thought that there could be risks to those.
Okay, so the risk of destroying the low orbit economy in terms of satellites might be real, but people aren't going to pay attention to it. But if we have a risk to astronauts, that will set people's attention.
Maybe. Well, as with other pollution issues, that may be the risks.
Yeah, David, your assessment of this?
So largely, I agree with Pacom that it is a real problem. Sustainable space operations is at threat, at least in theory, but I also think in reality, with all of the low Earth orbiting networks that are being launched, that my fear is that, yeah, something terrible might happen. It could involve, damage to a space station, at its worst case, a loss of life. But it could also be, critical communications are brought down for days or weeks on end. And then my fear is, quite honestly, that governments will impose both reasonable and unreasonable requirements on the industry. And I'm a big proponent of the industry on its own coming up with industry guidelines, best practices, call it what you may, that the industry should be proactive so that if and when something terrible happens, governments can be shown, hey, we have these practices, we have these guidelines. You don't need to over-regulate, or worse yet, impose a regulation which is commercially nonsensical. So I do very much see it as a real threat, and I would very much advocate that the industry be proactive, and to some extent it has been. Okay,
I guess that's, whether it has been sufficiently given what's coming in the next 5 years is another discussion. Greg.
Okay, so I agree.
Quickly.
The part I think that hasn't been said, you began to, I think, allude to it, Peter, is the effect it will have on the business of these LEO constellations themselves. Okay, I mean, David, you talked about the consequences of government intervening and imposing unreasonable response and unreasonable regulations. Pacom, I think you raised I think the thing that's going to set off the whistle that will energize the actual populations that make decisions and elect politicians, which is human life that'll be destroyed, and not to mention huge assets that we've invested in. But I think the most remarkable thing here is the cavalier nature of the approach that the operators themselves are taking to this. Because if I were putting up billions of dollars, and we started this conversation tonight talking about how difficult it is to raise money and all the dimensions involved, and how long it takes to get payoff, to to do the proverbial where you eat is insane. And we're talking about obviously people, and these are guys that are cowboys, and they are just, I don't know if they're trying to just prove they're macho or something, but they are taking unreasonable risks, which it's one thing to say, I'll take the risk for my company because it's my money and I'm going to take my chances because it's a big win. Put it all on red, put it all on black. But the reality is that they're also going to screw it up for everybody else, for every company that's to come, and for every user of these services that are going to be at a loss. And it's funny too, because two of those systems are backed by rocket launch companies. Okay, and I can't imagine that having this kind of debris scattering through its own sort of belt that will ring the Earth is going to make it any easier for them to be able to have launch windows without having their launches themselves for non-LEO purposes disrupted and endangered. So it's a cascading effect of terribles. And it's surprising that the industry itself, David, you're right, self-regulation is the first step, is just saying, well, space is a really big place. And so we're just too damn concerned. It's not a real problem. I think it is a real problem. And I think that when we are able to quantify it in terms of percentages of likelihood of collisions, of what we call conjunction events, when we're able to actually do this, and this is a science thing, this is not for policymakers like us, that can then turn those statistics into the likelihood of the ISS and the Chinese space station being cut up like Swiss cheese by massive clouds of orbital debris, increasing by X%. People are going to say, "Whoa, that's that's too much." So I think it may take something like that. Unfortunately, it may take actually a catastrophic event that is something way beyond anything we've seen so far to happen before we get the attention of the public, the politicians, the policymakers, and they put a stop to this. Hopefully, we as an industry can get there before that happens.
Well, yeah, and I'm not to defend the industry, but you'd think that the entity that has the most to lose in low Earth orbit in the world, which is called the U.S. Defense Department, would have been more proactive about this as well. But they have multiple interests, and some of their interests are on one side, some on the other. So it's not just cowboy profit motive. Robert, I get the last word on this.
Well, of course, I'm obviously in agreement with my colleagues. I mean, self-regulation would be the way to go. We just don't see a lot of evidence about it. The other big thing that's been missing is a business model. I've been thrilled in the last couple of years to see funded efforts to begin to get into debris mitigation, right? First time ever, because this is the tragedy of the commons. Nobody owns it. So if business models emerge, that's going to be a positive thing. Propulsion has been something that I've been sort of looking at, the argument over whether spacecraft need to have propulsion, or do we just put them up in orbit and wait to see what happens? It's like, that's an insane argument. Of course they need propulsion. The idea of throwing something into orbit that can't maneuver seems, frankly insane. So long term, we're talking about access to space. If you make 600 kilometers inaccessible, you've made the universe inaccessible. So it really is hard to believe that we're not taking this as seriously as it deserves.
And yet, that's the truth, and it's hard to believe.
Yeah,
but we still are 2 years in.
It's like one of the things I say about satellite. It's like one of the things I say about satellite, which is, unlike your mobile phone, which is in your pocket, those satellites up there, well, they're invisible, is what they are. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
All right, Robert, that is the last word because I'm already 3 or 4 minutes over. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Have a good 2022, and if we meet again in the year, it's likely to be just as busy as 2021 was. Thanks very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
All right.